You are to tithe under grace, not under the law. There are those who think because we're not under the law that we can rob God. What if I walked into your house, started taking things that belong to you, and then you said, "Why are you stealing from me, Bishop Brown?" And I tell you, because I'm not under law, I'm under grace. You would never think that that would give me permission to steal. And the same thing with those who think that being not under law means I can steal from God. Malachi chapter 3 makes it quite clear that when you don't tithe, you are robbing from God. Why? Because Leviticus 27 says the tithe belongs to the Lord. It is holy to him. So whenever we don't tithe, we're robbing God. So just because you're not under law anymore doesn't give you the permission to steal from God. You see, people will often tell me, but Jesus didn't tithe. How dare you make an outlandish statement that Jesus was a thief? If he did not tithe, then he could not be the Savior of the world, for he would have been a thief and robbed God. No, Jesus did tithe just as any good Israelite would tithe. In fact, Jesus affirmed it. How would he not tithe when he told the Pharisees that they should not neglect tithing? And yet you think he's going to neglect it after he told them not to neglect it? Of course not. No, but the difference is we're supposed to tithe under grace, not under law. You see, the law only deals with that portion of the beginning of Exodus through Deuteronomy that deals with how an Israelite was justified or made right with God. And that had to do with the priesthood, with the sacrifices, and with the temple. And then those things have passed away because we have a greater priest. We have a greater sacrifice. We have a greater temple, for we're the temple of the living God. You understand that? And of course, those parts of the law that do not deal with morality, like what you are not supposed to eat, whether you should have your hair long on the sideburns, things like that, or what kind of clothes you can wear. No, those things are, of course, gone because they don't deal with morality. But the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, he mentions the commandments like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, and he says they're summed up in loving your neighbor as yourself. So even Paul did not think because we're not under law, we're now free to steal, we're now free to rob. No, we're not. No, we're still supposed to bring our tithes to God. So tithing is actually the foundation of all other giving. So when you say to me, I like to give to the poor, that's fine. But unless you're tithing, you're still robbing God. Because tithing is the foundation of giving to the poor. How can you give to the poor when you're already robbing from God? I remember there was a guy in our church, we caught him stealing from our church. But he justified it. You know why? Because he would take some of what he stole from the church and he would give it to volunteers of the church because he felt like I should have paid those volunteers. Can you see the justification? I can steal from one so I can give to another. And that's what some of you are doing. You think because you give to the poor that somehow it justifies you robbing from God. No, it does not. So tithing is supposed to be under grace. So let me make this important statement. Tithing was never given by God in the Old Testament and the New to justify anyone. People will say, well, are you saying I have to tithe to go to heaven? Of course not. Tithing is not a test on whether or not you go to heaven or not. But it is a test on whether or not you are faithful to God. And every one of us want to be faithful. Abraham, he tithed to Melchizedek, his priest, because the purpose of tithing was to support those who are called into full-time ministry. And so Melchizedek was a full-time priest. And so Abraham, before the law was ever given, gave a tenth to him. Even Jacob said, Lord, I'll give you a tenth if you'll bless my journey. I'll give you 10% to this house of God. So the tithe was always meant to give to God's house where the ministers were there to serve. So that's why God incorporated the tithe into the Levitical law, and he used it to support the Levites who were there to serve as full-time ministers. That's why God instituted the tithe. So here's my question to you. In the church, do we have those who are called to full-time ministry? Of course. In the New Testament, there were the apostles and elders and bishops, and today we have bishops and elders and pastors who are called into full-time ministry. So just as God instituted the tithe to support those in the ministry. He's also instituted the tithe to support those in the New Testament ministry. So Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he recounts how the tithe was given to the Levites to support them. But then Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:14, he says, in the same way, God has called us to support those who are preaching the gospel full time. In other words, those who are preaching, we're supposed to support them like Levites were supported by the Israelites. So we tithe under the New Testament by giving to those who are called to full-time vocation to preaching the gospel. And that's how we tithe. But it's not tithing because I need to be justified. I'm afraid I'm going to go to hell if I don't tithe. No. In fact, even in under the Levitical law, tithing was never thought to be a means by which a person was justified. Under the Levitical law, they were justified because of the atonement of the animals. You understand? The priest that offered them on the right prescribed day of the festivals. That's how a person was justified. They never thought of tithing as justifying them. So we don't look at tithing as a means to be justified, but we look at it as a means by which we show our faithfulness to God. We pass the test of giving God the first tenth of our income, and we now give it not to the Levite priest, we now give it to the pastor, the ministers that are there to serve full time. And therefore you give it to the house of God, which would be considered the church of God, where God's people gather. And here's the thing. The promises of God are not nullified because the law is not here anymore. God still fulfills his promises. And since he's promised to bless those who tithe, he will still bless those who tithe today.